All right, now for the next part, we're going to begin with the settlement house movement, which is kind of what we've already talked about as far as Jane Addams is concerned. And it is begun in the late 1800s. It actually starts in England, and Jane Addams and Lillian Wald experience the what the settlement houses that they developed in England as a response to industrialization. And the whole concept was that you would live in a poor neighborhood and create a nice, clean facility that would show them an alternative, kind of a middle class way to live, as opposed to the squalor that they were used to. Think in terms of like a halfway house, right? Or you could have a halfway house. You could have I'm trying to think of another good example. Kind of like a shelter, but not your basic, cot kind of, in a gymnasium shelter. Rather a shelter that allows them to have their own room, and there's people that check on them and make sure that they're getting training and that kind of thing. So it's meant to help improve these conditions. Jane Addams and Hull House in Chicago, Lillian Wald and the Henry Street Settlement in not Washington, D.C., in New York. And they provide medical care, recreation, English classes, hot lunches. And this is where we get the idea of social work from. It's kind of the beginning of that, because it's actually living in that community, and women are a big part of that. This is a picture of Hull House in Chicago, the way it was initially. The University of Chicago, I think, yes, is now kind of built up around Hull House. I actually got to visit there a couple years ago, and it was quite fascinating. This part right here, I got to walk in that room. They have all these displays set up now, and those stairs, and Jane Addams' bedroom was upstairs, and there were various progressive reformers that would stay in this main house right there. But you can see that it was a very nice, kind of clean atmosphere. People could come in and they could say, oh, so this is what it's like to be middle class, right? They had also buildings where they would teach people to cook, how to, be sanitary, how to, wash clothes, how to provide medical care, teach little kids to read, provide daycare for kids, that kind of thing. And so it's into this kind of momentum that we see with the women's suffrage movement emerge. And of course, the women's suffrage movement doesn't just appear out of nowhere. One thing you should have, if you've been listening to me all year, this goes back to Abigail Adams telling John Adams to remember the ladies, that the women have sacrificed as much as the men and they deserve the right to vote. Goes back to Mary Wollstonecraft, who over in Europe at the turn of the 1800s writes that women are being kept down, essentially. So the 1800s was full of women that challenged this idea. Angelina and Sarah Grimke are known for having challenged this in the mid-1800s. So you have the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 that has the Declaration of Sentiments that basically calls for women to have the right to vote. And so women were always arguing that they were smart enough, they were educated enough, and that they were one of the arguments was that women were more morally pure, that we were more honorable, that we were less prone to corruption and all that kind of stuff, and so that we would help clean up politics, and that this would protect, kind of put the interests of the home at the forefront of politics as opposed to the interests of business, which is what, kind of what they argued. Now, I think that's an overstatement. Women are human beings just like men are, and so women aren't always necessarily more moral than men. And so I think that's a little bit of kind of a double-edged sword there. It's a double standard, but that was certainly the argument, going into the 20th century. And so, and obviously it failed, right? Because women don't get the right to vote until 1920. So it's not effective. And then by the time you get to, 1855, 1860, most women buy into the argument that ending slavery is more important. And I think arguably it could be said that it was. So if you look at, at the Civil War, women have to step back and let the Civil War happen. Then blacks get the rights and get citizenship and voting rights. And when the 15th Amendment is passed, there's a number of key women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are quite upset that women are not included in the 15th Amendment. And of course, the response was, well, it never would have passed if women had been a part of it. And so a lot of women were quite angry after the 15th Amendment, saying, you've got these black men that don't know how to read that can now vote, and here I am, an educated woman, and I can't. And they were quite upset. And so after the Civil War, the women's groups kind of fracture for a little bit between women that are saying, okay, this is fine, we're going to keep pushing, and women that were quite angry over it. And so the women's groups fracture apart. And it's not until like roughly 1890-ish, 1880, I don't know, my women's suffrage group, if they were here, could remind me of the correct date. But you're going to have the women's group, NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, be the group that kind of brings everybody back together and gets them pulling in the same direction again. And so NAWSA, which ultimately, the big name with NAWSA that you need to remember is Carrie Chapman Catt. They focus on a state-by-state grassroots campaign, saying that rather than focusing on getting a national amendment, they're going to try to get this state-by-state, and that if we can do that, then women will eventually gain enough votes. The problem with that is it's a very slow process. They're fairly successful in the western states. The western states, which are desperate to have voters and they don't have a huge population anyways, are willing to let women vote. But your southern and your eastern states, absolutely not. And so really by the time you get to, like 1914, I think it is, there's only like 9 states that are allowing women to vote. And so it's into this that you're going to see the National Women's Party emerge. Alice Paul will come into this, and she's younger than Carrie Chapman Catt. She's much more radical. And she had been over in England with the Pankhursts, which is a radical group of women that threw bricks and did hunger strikes and all this kind of stuff to call attention to women not getting the vote in England. And she comes back, and she's a part of NAWSA, and she argues for a congressional committee to argue for a federal amendment. And so she starts kind of collecting money and working Washington, D.C. and all this kind of stuff. And she kind of makes Carrie Chapman Catt mad because she's very successful at raising money. And so Carrie Chapman Catt kind of cuts her off, and Alice Paul gets mad then, and she takes her toys and she creates her own party, the National Women's Party. Now, the National Women's Party is different from NAWSA, which is kind of a broad, yes, women getting the right to vote is a part of their program, but they also focus on other legislation. The National Women's Party only focused on getting an amendment for women to vote. And so they start a process of fundraising, protesting, marching. They famously, when Woodrow Wilson wins his election in 1914, they have a march during his inaugural week, calling attention to the fact that women don't have the vote. And, and so they kind of, then there's like a fight breaks out and some women get kind of hit and that kind of stuff, and that makes the newspapers. Then when World War I breaks out, women still don't have the vote. And so they continue to picket the White House, right? They basically stand outside on the sidewalk with these signs that say, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty and all this kind of stuff. Well, they started doing that before World War I, but then the war happens and they continue to do it. Well, that's just kind of most people, now in our 21st century thinking, we're accustomed to Vietnam, so we don't think of protesting the president as being really shocking. But in World War I, to protest a president during wartime seemed really awful. And so these women, there was a Sedition Act that had been passed that could put you in jail for criticizing the government. And so Alice Paul very cleverly would quote President Wilson on her banners. Things like, we're going to fight for the right of all people to have a say in their government. And then she would have another banner that said, so many thousands of women are unrepresented. And so she would call attention to the fact that women weren't allowed to vote. And they get very upset about this, and so they pass this regulation, or they enforce this regulation that you can't block a sidewalk. and they arrest these women. These women refuse to plead guilty or pay the fine, and so they get thrown into a workhouse for 60 days or whatever, which is basically a women's prison. And they then go on a hunger strike. And eventually word gets out about the hunger strike. They force feed her. It's really kind of horrible. If somebody reminds me, I'll show you a video clip of it. Yes, it's horrible, and I'll show you a video. And so eventually they get enough attention that, and Woodrow Wilson puts it forth as kind of a war effort, that women deserve to have the right to vote after helping them fight World War I. And it does pass. I believe it passes. It's proposed in 1919. It's not finally ratified until 1920. And there's a whole interesting side story. It barely gets ratified. That takes this guy from Tennessee who gets a telegram from his mother telling him to vote for suffrage, and he's kind of the vote that breaks that allows it to be ratified. And there were there's a lot of debate over this. Over, was it good for women to vote? There were pro-suffrage, anti-suffrage things. And so there was a lot of argument over this. A lot of emphasis on women as being kind of pure and voting, or mothers, and that their votes would somehow make society better because they were better. So yeah, lots of different kinds of things. The other side effect of progressivism is this idea of controlling the masses. That so many of these people just don't know better. They don't know how to live and how to work. And so you see that eugenics and Anglo-Saxonism and immigration restriction and Americanization become the big concepts. Eugenics is the idea that we can trace certain characteristics across ethnicities, that certain characteristics are inherited, even though now we know they aren't. Eugenics is really kind of the foundation for Hitler's final solution, if you want the honest truth. It's the idea that certain races are inferior and that we have to help them, and that certain people that, we have to keep people from, if you have a certain issue, if you're dyslexic or you have a mentally challenged person, they shouldn't have babies because that's just going to produce more of them. That living in poverty is hereditary in the sense that just having a baby means that baby's going to be poor, as opposed to looking at kind of the large, the environmental stuff. Margaret Sanger was a proponent of eugenics, and that's part of why she believed in birth control. Anglo-Saxonism, the idea that people of an Anglo-Saxon, which is Britain and France, that those people are somehow a little bit better than everybody else, that English culture's better, English behavior's better, English music, English literature, all that kind of stuff. The concerns about controlling immigration comes from this, and the idea, that we need to indoctrinate immigrants into America. We're going to have the Anti-Saloon League that tries to come out very strongly against alcohol consumption. We'd seen, if you remember back in like the 1840s when the Irish came over, the emergence of kind of the temperance movement. And it had some influence, but back then it was more about moderation, right? It wasn't about prohibition. Once we get to the progressive movement, they start talking about actually prohibiting it. The Christian Women's Temperance Union becomes a huge political, no, let me rephrase that. That was a hyperbole. Not huge. They become a significant minor influence. Is that contradictory? In politics, in that they argue that we need to have prohibition of alcohol. And they begin to have kind of this third-party effect. Even though they're not officially a political third party, they're a significant lobbying group that gets a lot of politicians to start supporting the idea of restricting alcohol. There's dry counties, wet counties. If you ever become a historian and focus on Texas history, there's all kinds of stuff about this dry versus wet battle in the early 20th century. It caused people to lose, caused fights. Like literal fist fights over it. Really nasty elections, that kind of stuff. So the Christian Women's Temperance Union is a big part of kind of this period because they really advocated for controlling alcohol. The idea being that the reason there's poverty, the reason children are neglected, the reason women keep having so many babies is because the men are drunk all the time. And that the saloons encourage political corruption, and if they couldn't make money selling alcohol, then they wouldn't exist. And so they come up with all these ideas for why we need to limit alcohol, and eventually will lead to the 18th Amendment that will take effect in 1920. And of course, we know that this amendment doesn't work out very well, right? It gets repealed with the 21st Amendment. Remember, when you're 18, you can drink. When you're 21, you can't. So we know it doesn't work out very well, that it's a poorly advised kind of piece of legislation. But there's more to it than that, which I'll go into when we get to the 1920s. Just know that this is kind of the foundation for that. They attempt to ban red light districts and ban prostitution. Progressive reformers like Teddy Roosevelt, when he's in charge of New York City, will actively go after these saloons, trying to stop them. The one downside to progressivism, for all that they were about being up in people's business, they don't really pay much attention to segregation, discrimination, Jim Crow, disfranchisement, lynching, violence against blacks, that kind of thing. They kind of don't want to be bothered with that. They've got much bigger fish to fry, and so progressivism is one of the ugly parts of progressivism is it's very racist. It doesn't care about blacks at all, unless, of course, they're wanting to take care of you and treat you like you're not capable of doing anything yourself. And it's into this environment that the NAACP will be founded. Initially, it's known as the Niagara Movement. W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, and a few others end up traveling to Niagara Falls, New York. They have to go to the Canada side so they can stay in a hotel because New York had discrimination. And they began to create an organization that where their whole advocacy is for political opportunity. Initially, in the early 1900s, the NAACP is kind of a new organization. Hasn't totally figured out how it's going to go about securing political rights. But by the time you get to the 1930s, the NAACP will have figured it out, and they start to become very good at pushing things through the legal system and challenging laws that are bad. So that kind of tells you the beginning of what will become the civil rights movement. The overshadowing curse, the legalized saloon. Poor little girl with a nasty little hand coming down. Our religion demands that every child should have a fair chance for citizenship in the coming kingdom. Our patriotism demands a saloonless country and a stainless flag. So, in other words, democracy was directly tied into controlling alcohol consumption. And so this is kind of an element of kind of that fundamentalism that we'll see really take hold of the United States in the 1920s. Attempts to reform politics, political machines don't like the progressive controls and reforms. They get very resentful of these women who are trying to tell them what to do. And of course, the progressive reforms are trying to get rid of the political bosses so that nice middle-class people can vote and have a uplifting effect on politics. The big change here is going to be the Galveston hurricane. The Galveston hurricane hits in 1900, and until Hurricane Katrina in 2008, it was the most significant hurricane natural disaster that had hit the country. What had happened in Galveston was it was your typical Gilded Age city. It was kind of up and coming. It was kind of a hotbed of activity. Of course, we don't think of it that way now. That's because Houston has superseded it. But in 1900, that was not the case. It was a viable competitor for being the dominant power in South Texas. And so Galveston was controlled by kind of your classic party boss system where you had different wards and different ward bosses, and they answered to different city councilmen and all this kind of stuff. And so Galveston was very kind of inefficient in that way. And the hurricane hits and kills thousands of people, and very dramatic, destroys a big chunk of the town. And so people are very upset by this. And so they start looking at Galveston, and initially the cleanup efforts seem to go pretty well until all of a sudden the bodies start washing back ashore because they don't get rid of them, dispose of them properly. And it's into this that the progressive reformers really begin to attack the city government. And so they come up with this whole new system of where you hire a city manager who's an expert at management. And, you've got a city council that's elected, but it's elected by, they change the way the districts are drawn up so that you don't have this kind of neighborhood mentality. And so the Galveston hurricane brings in kind of the council form of government for cities that we really kind of know are everywhere today. And so that's a progressive reform right there. Robert La Follette in Wisconsin. He is I think a senator, maybe House of Representatives, but I'm pretty sure it's senator. In Wisconsin, he starts talking about breaking the power of the political machines and how they use their state legislatures to select senators. And he says the public needs to have more say in government. So he proposes the reforms of an initiative, which is where the voters get to say, we want this on the ballot. We want to see what we think this is a good idea, where the voters themselves can propose solutions and have them be voted on. Of course, you have to have a certain percentage of signatures. And said, there's a process to that, but it's still a way you can have this done. A referendum, which allows you to actually say, we approve of this idea. Sunnyvale, when they had the selling beer and wine vote a year or two ago, that's a referendum. When they, how does the community feel about beer and wine sales? How does the community feel about, rezoning this particular area? So that's what a referendum does. And a recall is where you have a corrupt politician and you can vote to have him removed from office. The big one that we have today that we live with on a regular basis is called a primary. This is meant to keep the political parties and political machines from handpicking candidates based on, who their friends are. And so a primary is meant to make people within a party, the Republicans, the Democrats, whatever, campaign for votes among the population. And so our candidates now go through a primary election, and then they go through the general election. The idea being that they have to win your vote twice, basically, and that we get to have a say with who's going to run for office. Of course, now we feel like the primary system perhaps is a little bit too much, that it makes the elections run too long, that it contributes to voter apathy, it contributes to radical opinions because they have to appeal to a radical base during the primary, and then they have trouble transitioning to a general populace during the regular elections. So those are some valid concerns about primaries, but we still have those today, and they were in essence created to try to stop the political machines. And so I leave it up to you to decide if they were really effective. I'm going to stop it here before I pick up with the presidents. That way you can take a break, and then we'll start talking about who the different progressive presidents are.